Welcome to the deep dive. So you've handed us a really compelling stack of material today. It's all centered on maximizing performance, extending longevity, and, really fortifying foundational health. But we're not just here to summarize. Our mission is to pull out the most scientifically sound, the most actionable, and frankly, the most surprising tools that activate your body's own resilience.
The built-in resilience.
Exactly. We're looking for those shortcuts to long-term health. Okay, let's jump in.
So the foundational concept, the thing that really ties all of these sources together, is this idea that the human system is, well, it's fundamentally designed for challenge.
Designed for challenge,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, if you look at our evolutionary history, we were intermittently challenging ourselves constantly. Having to pursue prey, enduring cold nights, dealing with periods where there just wasn't much food.
Right. Scarcity.
Scarcity, exactly.
Yeah.
So physical activity, what we now call intermittent fasting, exposure to heat, to cold, these aren't modern luxuries. They are the kinds of intermittent challenges we evolved with.
And this is where that core concept, hormesis, becomes so important, right? That's our guiding principle here. This idea that a small, measured dose of a stressor is actually profoundly beneficial.
Precisely.
So when we introduce these challenges intentionally, what's actually happening at, say, the genetic level? Why does that temporary discomfort lead to this lasting resilience?
What you're doing is activating specific genetic pathways. We broadly call them stress response pathways. And what's fascinating is that these pathways don't just mobilize the body to deal with that one stressor, like the cold.
It's not a one-and-done thing.
Not at all. They stay active afterward. They help you deal with the daily sort of background stress of normal metabolism. They optimize your immune function, and they actively slow down the aging process itself. This response gives you these powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects system-wide.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. The crosstalk between these different challenges. You'd think a physical stressor and a dietary one would trigger totally separate responses, but the sources show this remarkable overlap.
Absolutely. I mean, take heat shock proteins, or HSPs, as an example. The name tells you they're activated most robustly by high temperatures, right, to protect our cells.
Makes sense.
But when you look closer, plant compounds like sulfurophane, which we're about to get into, are also powerful activators of those same HSPs. And so is cold exposure. It just confirms that the body has this unified language of survival.
And there are many different inputs that can speak it.
Exactly.
That sets the stage perfectly for our first category then, the chemical challenge from our diet. If we're looking for the foundational nutrients that act like these beneficial stressors, where do we even begin?
We begin with what is arguably the most powerful one, sulforaphane. It's the best chemical trigger we know of for NRF2 activation, which is the body's master detoxification and cleanup pathway.
And we find this in cruciferous vegetables.
Primarily, yes, but for the maximum effect, you really need to focus on broccoli sprouts. The sources note that sprouts can have up to 100 times more sulforaphane than the mature broccoli plant.
100 times more. That is a huge differential. So, okay, let's define the mechanism. What is NRF2? And why is activating it so critical for longevity?
Think of NRF2 less as a single pathway and more like the master regulator switch for your cell's resilience. When sulforaphane flips that switch, NRF2 tells the cell to ramp up all of its internal defenses.
Okay.
Crucially, it dramatically regulates the genes involved in making glutathione. And glutathione is the body's primary, most potent antioxidant, especially in the brain and the vascular system. NRF2 also helps detoxify harmful compounds like heterocyclic amines that can form when you cook meat at high heat.
The relevance of this really hit me when I was reading about those genome-wide associated studies, the GWA studies. It's one thing to talk about a pathway, but it's another to see a nutrient actually override a genetic weakness.
That's the aha moment, isn't it? The GWA studies found people who lacked a really effective version of a gene, which left them very prone to colon cancer.
A genetic predisposition.
Right. But the researchers found these people could essentially negate that inherited risk just by regularly eating cruciferous vegetables. The sulforaphane was activating their glutathione transferase pathway so robustly that it completely compensated for the faulty gene they had.
So your diet is literally compensating for a genetic shortfall.
It is. The power of this input is just enormous.
Okay, so practically speaking, I'll confess, the idea of chewing on a bowl of raw, bitter sprouts every day isn't that appealing. What's the hack here?
That's a great question because cooking does significantly lower the bioavailability of sulforaphane. The heat deactivates an enzyme myrosinase that you need to convert the precursor into the usable form. but the sources had a fantastic tip. You can add just 1 gram of ground mustard seed powder to your cooked broccoli. The mustard seed provides that missing enzyme externally.
And what does that do to the levels?
It increases the available sulforaphane fourfold. It's an inexpensive, incredibly simple booster. And it's also worth noting moringa powder, which is a related NRF2 activator.
That's a game changer. Okay, let's move to our second superstar compound, the marine omega-3s, EPA and DHA. We find these in fatty fish, high-quality triglyceride forms. We hear about them all the time, but why do they play such a powerful dual role in inflammation and brain function?
They're critical for 2 main reasons. First, yes, they're powerful anti-inflammatories, but not just because they reduce it. They ensure the resolution of inflammation.
The resolution.
Yeah, when you get hurt, inflammation is necessary, but if it lingers, it causes chronic damage. DHA metabolizes into molecules called resolvins. You can think of them as the immune system's cleanup crew.
Okay, so they come in and tidy up afterwards.
Exactly. They, along with other specialized pro-resolving molecules, or SPMs, make sure that inflammation resolves completely. And EPA specifically can blunt inflammatory responses, which is critical because inflammation is known to inhibit the release of serotonin in the brain.
So if you're chronically inflamed, your body is literally preventing you from having normal mood regulation.
That's exactly right. And the second mechanism is structural. This is why DHA is so foundational for the brain. It's a critical structural part of every single neuron cell membrane.
Part of the cell itself.
Yes. It affects the membrane's fluidity, and that fluidity dictates the function of everything embedded in it, including vital receptors for things like dopamine and serotonin.
Yeah.
If you're deficient in DHA, those receptors are structurally impaired. They just can't transmit signals as well.
That is a staggering implication. Your diet literally determines the structural integrity of your brain's communication network. And you can measure this with the omega-3 index.
You can. The sources point to a clear threshold of around 2 grams per day to get to a protective level. The omega-3 index measures the percentage of omega-3s in your red blood cells, which turn over about every 120 days.
Right.
The standard American diet often leaves people with an index of about 5%. Now, contrast that with Japan, where it's around 10 to 11%. That difference is associated with about a 5-year increased life expectancy.
A 5-year difference in lifespan.
Yeah.
Tied directly to one measurable blood metric. That's not a subtle health boost. That is a dramatic difference.
It's massive. And the data reinforces it from the other side, too. An index of 4% or lower was linked to a 5-year decreased life expectancy compared to those at 8%.
Wow.
It's one of the clearest examples in the sources of a single input driving huge longevity results. For anyone looking to test, the IAFSO website is a good resource for third-party testing that also checks for things like oxidation and mercury.
Okay, from building blocks and detoxifiers, let's pivot to the master regulator, vitamin D3. The deficiency rates are just striking. Something like 70% of the U.S. population is below that inadequate level of 30 nanograms per milliliter. The goal is 40 to 60.
And what's fascinating is we call it a vitamin, but functionally it's a steroid hormone. It's not passive. It binds to a specific receptor, complexes with the retinoid receptor, and then goes into the cell nucleus.
Into the command center.
Right into the command center. There, it finds and recognizes what are called vitamin D response elements, or VDREs. And through this mechanism, vitamin D regulates over 5% of the entire protein-encoded human genome.
5% of the genome. That is immense regulatory power.
Yeah.
What are the most critical functions it's regulating for longevity and mood?
Well, the sources highlight several. It's absolutely essential for immune function, for bone homeostasis, for blood pressure. But maybe most relevant for this discussion, it regulates the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, too.
And that is the enzyme
That's the one responsible for converting tryptophan into serotonin inside the brain. So just like with omega-3s, vitamin D is directly tied into your neurotransmitter landscape.
The implication data from those Mendelian randomization studies you mentioned really drove home just how necessary optimal levels are, even if you don't feel sick.
Exactly. Those studies looked at common genetic variations, NIPS, that make some people less efficient at converting vitamin D into its active form. And these gene variations, independent of blood levels, correlated with higher all-cause mortality, increased respiratory and cancer mortality, and a higher risk of multiple sclerosis.
So even a subtle long-term impairment has this cascade of negative outcomes.
A huge cascade, yes.
So for the listener who tests low or maybe just wants to be cautious, how should they approach supplementing?
Well, testing is always the gold standard, but as a general rule of thumb from the sources, 1,000 IUs of vitamin D will raise your blood levels by about 5 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay, so you could do the math.
You can do the math. If you're at 20 and want to get to 40, you'd need about 4,000 IUs daily to start. The sources generally say 1,000 to 5,000 IUs daily is safe for most people. There was even a small study cited where 4,000 IUs a day reversed epigenetic aging by about 3 years in deficient people.
3 years, wow. And of course, get some sun.
Of course, intentional sun exposure is still necessary.
Let's move to the invisible insufficiency, magnesium. The deficiency rates here are massive, 240% of the U.S. population, and the sources give a really simple visual clue as to why.
They do. That 40% statistic tells you one thing. People are not eating their dark leafy greens. Magnesium sits right at the very center of the chlorophyll molecule. It's what makes spinach, kale, and chard green.
So if vitamin D is the master regulator, what is magnesium's role? What does it let the cell actually do?
It's a foundational cofactor. It's essential for both making and utilizing ATP, which is the energy currency for every single function in your body. But for longevity, its role as a critical cofactor for all DNA repair enzymes is, well, it's non-negotiable.
And this is where the insufficiency becomes so insidious. A vitamin C deficiency is obvious scurvy, but magnesium deficiency is this invisible slow burn damage.
Precisely. Unlike scurvy, which is acute and painful, magnesium insufficiency causes DNA damage that just accrues, unseen, over decades. Your body is constantly repairing thousands of tiny breaks in your DNA, but those repair enzymes absolutely require magnesium. If you're low, that cumulative damage just speeds up the aging process.
And for supplementation, what varieties should people look for to avoid GI distress?
The sources tend to prefer forms like magnesium malate or magnesium threonate. They're much less likely to cause the laxative effect you get with cheaper forms like magnesium oxide.
Okay, we've nailed the chemical challenges.
Yeah.
Now let's shift back to the physical ones, heat and cold. We noted there's some pathway overlap, but the adaptations are distinct. Let's start with cold exposure.
Yes. And while everyone talks about the shock, the sources really emphasize the immediate cognitive benefit. Deliberate cold exposure, even just 3 minutes around 49 degrees Fahrenheit, causes a sustained release of dopamine.
And that sustained release is the key, right? It's not a spike.
It is. Most stimulants give you a spike and then a crash. The cold provides this slowly elevating, sustained release that can last for hours. You get enhanced focus and mood without the jitters or the burnout. But the real longevity benefit comes from long-term adaptation.
Which is?
Increased mitochondrial biogenesis.
Okay, so how does the cold force us to become more efficient? Explain uncoupling thermogenesis.
When you get very cold, your body can make heat in 2 ways. Shivering is inefficient. The more elegant solution is uncoupling thermogenesis, driven by specialized brown fat. The mitochondria in these cells basically uncouple their electrochemical gradient and they burn fuel lipids, glucose, to produce pure heat instead of ATP.
So you're literally forcing your system to become a tiny, efficient furnace.
A tiny furnace, exactly. And the long-term benefit is that your body responds by making more furnaces. The norepinephrine from the cold regulates a protein called PGC1 alpha, which promotes mitochondrial biogenesis in your fat tissue. It's called the browning of fat. You create a larger pool of new, healthy mitochondria, which is a huge factor in anti-aging.
Let's pivot to the opposite stressor, heat. Sauna use, for example. 30 minutes at 189 degrees. The physiological overlap with aerobic exercise is just profound.
It's uncanny. While you're in the heat, your heart rate and blood pressure go up just as if you were running. But then when you leave, your resting heart rate and blood pressure actually decrease below your baseline. This makes it an incredible tool, especially for people who can't exercise vigorously.
But the real attention-grabbing evidence comes from those massive Finnish longevity studies. I mean, the data on mortality risk is almost unbelievable.
The Finnish studies are the gold standard. The data showed that using a sauna 4 to 7 times a week compared to only once a week, it resulted in a staggering 50% reduction in cardiovascular mortality risk.
50%.
And a greater than 60% reduction in risk for dementia and Alzheimer's. These aren't minor correlations, these are massive reductions tied to a regular habit.
And crucially, this benefit is dose-dependent on how long you're in there, which really suggests it's causal.
That's the key takeaway. For that maximum cardiovascular benefit, the duration had to be more than 19 minutes at about 174 degrees. If the men were only in for 11 minutes, the mortality reduction just plummeted to only 8%.
So you have to stay in long enough to really trigger the response?
You do. You have to fully activate that cellular stress response.
And what are the mechanisms being activated in that critical 20-minute window?
Primarily, it's the heat shock proteins, the HSPs. They are robustly activated and act like powerful chaperones, protecting other proteins from clumping together. This is highly relevant for diseases like Alzheimer's, where protein aggregation is a major problem. There was even one study that showed local heat prevented almost 40% of muscle atrophy during disuse.
So it's protecting muscle mass, too.
An incredibly protective effect, yes.
For those who don't have a sauna, the sources did mention a simple alternative.
They did. A 20-minute hot bath at 104 degrees Fahrenheit with your shoulders submerged has been shown to be enough to activate those protective HSPs and also increase BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is crucial for learning and memory.
We've covered a remarkable amount of territory, from physical challenges like intentional cold and heat to the chemical challenges from these foundational nutrients, sulfurophane, omega-3s, vitamin D3, and magnesium. The takeaway seems so clear. Small, deliberate, intermittent challenges are the key to activating our own genetic resilience.
And just remember that unifying principle of structure and function. DHA affects the literal structure of your most critical receptors. Vitamin D regulates the key enzymes. The foundational inputs you provide literally dictate how efficiently your most essential processes work.
So since both heat and cold stimulate these key longevity pathways, heat shock proteins, mitochondrial biogenesis, how might you intentionally incorporate the rhythm of both heat and cold into your weekly routine to amplify their benefits? Think about cycling through that full spectrum of resilience to truly maximize your cellular defenses as you process this deep dive. Thank you for diving in with us.
My pleasure.
And that's the deep dive.